Thank you very much, Russell, and to IPPR Scotland for hosting this event, and to you for setting the scene so well. A particular heartfelt thank you for just a few weeks after the general election, reminding me that we face yet another election just next year, if I needed reminding of that. But I think you very ably summed up some of the challenges, but big opportunities that lie ahead. And thank you to all of you for coming along here today for what I hope will be an interesting and valuable discussion. The work that IPPR has done over the last 4 years, slightly more than that now, on economic justice has, in my view, made a really important contribution to a crucial area of policy, an area of policy that matters now in the decisions we are taking now, but matters in terms of how we, as Russell set out, confront the big defining challenges that we face here in Scotland and that we face in common with the rest of the world. And I think this work that IPPR has done is a really good example of the way in which certainly the Scottish Government, but I think wider civic society too, benefits from the work of good quality policy organisations like this one. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to discuss this work at this particular time. We have, of course, just entered a new year, indeed a new decade, and yet in some ways, and Russell alluded to much of this in his introduction, we're still dealing with the legacy of the decade that has just ended. If we look back over the past 10 years, we see the climate crisis, ignored perhaps for too long, move definitively from being something which many people, certainly in developed countries, saw as abstract, as a threat, yes, but only in the future, to being something which is immediate and urgent and already impacting on and changing our lives. The 2010s also saw low productivity and low growth in many developed nations, certainly here in the UK, with big and quite profound and lasting consequences for living standards and, by extension, I would argue, for faith in politics and our political systems. And of course, and these things are very closely related. In 2016, we had the referendum on EU membership. And as a consequence of that vote, in just 9 days' time, the UK will leave the European Union, against, of course, the will of the majority of people here in Scotland. Now, you will be mightily relieved to hear, I'm sure, that I'm not going to talk in any great detail about Brexit today, but I do think it is an example, perhaps the biggest example with the most acute consequences of how these issues that I've already mentioned are interlinked and cannot be seen in isolation. Now, my view is that the UK government, or governments I should say, because it spans different administrations, made a major mistake over the past decade and slightly more than that by prioritising welfare cuts and austerity over investment in growth, in public services and better living standards. And we have felt and feel the impact of that here in Scotland very acutely in our public services and in a wider sense as well. Austerity undoubtedly exacerbated and indeed arguably created some of the concerns which then led UK-wide to that Brexit decision in 2016. However, the big worry, or one of the big worries I have now, is that Brexit, rather than helping to boost productivity and growth and lead to a greater focus on inclusion and economic justice, may instead enable UK government to pursue an even more misguided economic policy over the next decade. In particular, any departure from European Union regulatory standards in order to sign trade deals with other countries, or indeed to try to reshape the economy domestically, is likely to be contrary to the interests of Scotland. I would argue contrary to the interests of fairness and justice across the UK. And I'll return at the end of my remarks to that question of deregulation, what many fear, what I fear as a race to the bottom, but as part of a broader discussion on economic justice. More fundamentally today, I want to set out the ways in which Scotland is seeking to pursue a distinctive approach to economic growth, one which invests in innovation and business competitiveness, while also supporting a fairer and more equal society. And to do that, I'll cover three issues in particular. In a moment, I'll talk about decarbonisation and automation, two massive economic shifts which will shape all of our lives in the coming decade and way beyond that. And I'll then talk about how fair work is absolutely crucial, in my view, to our drive to improve productivity, raise living standards and help to create that fairer and more equal society that we seek. But I want to say a word or two, first of all, about our overall approach to government. Earlier today, by happy coincidence actually, I was at a conference of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a group of organisations seeking to change traditional economic models so that they focus on people's well-being rather than just on narrow measurements of economic growth. And as you might know, that's an idea that Scotland is not just sympathetic to, but in some ways has been leading the developing thinking around. We're a founding member of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group. That's a partnership of three small countries, ourselves, New Zealand and Iceland, working together to exchange ideas about measuring and promoting well-being. Perhaps incidentally, perhaps not, I will leave you to draw your own conclusions. All three of these countries, of course, are currently led by women, which may or may not have significance. But these forums have been created in response to a growing awareness, a belated awareness, but nevertheless now, I think, rapidly growing in many different countries around the world that national success can't be measured simply or solely through gross domestic product, GDP, which is the traditional way in which we measure it. And why is that the case? Because while GDP measures the outputs from our work, it says nothing at all about whether that work is fulfilling. It places a value on, for example, illegal drug consumption, but no value whatsoever on unpaid care. And it gives a value to activity which certainly boosts economic growth in the short term, but it does so regardless of whether that activity is contributing to making our planet uninhabitable in the longer term. So measuring economic growth in that narrow sense, I'm not saying is unimportant or completely irrelevant, but I think when you consider it for even a moment or two, it becomes obvious that it cannot be the sole measurement. It is not the be-all and end-all. Governments have a duty to think about the wider context, the well-being as well as the wealth of our countries and our citizens. And for the Scottish Government, that's reflected and intended to be reflected in our national performance framework. That framework sets out our core purpose as a country. We want to improve well-being as well as, and as part of, supporting sustainable and inclusive economic growth. It focuses on values, kindness, dignity and compassion, which we see as being crucial to the type of country we want to be. And it goes hand in hand with a social partnership approach to policy making. We consulted very widely on the content of the National Performance Framework, and we know that we must work in partnership with public, private, voluntary sectors to achieve the aims of it. Now, none of this, and it's a point I stressed this morning and want to stress again here today, none of this means that we turn our backs on the importance of having a strong, vibrant, growing economy. In fact, as the IPPR noted, over the past 20 years, Scotland has had the best economic performance of any part of the UK outside of London and the South East. But what that approach does mean is that we recognise that economic policy is a means rather than an end. It's a means by which we help people to live happy, healthy, fulfilling lives. And if it's not achieving that, then we've got to change the approach we're taking. We also recognise, and again this is increasingly recognised, that economic growth is likely to be more sustainable if it is more broadly based. We know, to quote IPPR again, that a fairer economy is a stronger economy, the quote that Russell already shared with us. So that focus on well-being, on ensuring that growth is sustainable, fair, and that it improves our quality of life will continue over the coming decade, not just here in Scotland, but I hope in increasing numbers of countries across the world. Because the importance of that approach now is more apparent than it was when we published the National Performance Framework, and becomes more apparent, I think, with every day that passes. And one reason for that, not the only reason, but one big and driving reason for that is, of course, the climate crisis. It is becoming more and more obvious, as I alluded to a moment ago, that it makes no sense. In fact, it is morally indefensible to focus purely on growth when some of the measures that create that growth in the short term are doing real, lasting and arguably irreversible damage to our planet in the longer term. On tackling climate change, Scotland, in terms of the ambition that we are setting and also in terms of some of the actions that we are already taking, is rightly in a leadership position. We've already legislated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030, and by 2045, of course, our aim is to be a net zero emitter of all greenhouse gas emissions. And achieving that will affect everything. It will affect every aspect of our lives, the design of our cities, the way we travel, how we heat our homes. It will require an end to the throwaway culture that most of us have grown up with, and the creation of a more circular economy. It will involve tree planting, peatland restoration, alongside, of course, the development of new and existing technologies. And in many areas, and this is a key point, and I think it's a key point in terms of persuading people that this journey can be a fair and just one. In many areas, including here in Scotland, wave and tidal power, battery storage, smart grids, our aim must be to ensure that as far as possible those technologies and innovations can be designed, developed and made here in Scotland. We've got a long way to go to make that a reality, but that must be the aim that we set ourselves. Tackling climate change, and I think it's always important to say this, particularly when we see the impact that it's having right now on parts of our world. First and foremost, tackling that is a moral imperative. But if we get it right, it will also be a massive opportunity, because many of the changes that we are going to require to make to meet those emissions targets will also reduce our energy use. They will improve air quality and our natural environment, and therefore lead to improvements in our public health. And they do have the potential to transform our economy and create high-skilled, highly paid jobs as well. Yesterday in the Scottish Parliament, actually, we took an important step towards equipping ourselves to seize some of these opportunities. The Parliament passed the legislation that will establish the new Scottish National Investment Bank, a public state-owned investment bank that will provide long-term what's called patient capital over the next decade, and its work, of course, will be driven by missions, enabling us to address some of these big defining challenges. And the bank's primary mission will be to support the transition to a low and then net zero carbon economy. The bank is, without a doubt, in my view, one of the defining economic measures of this Scottish Parliament, and it does have the potential to be genuinely transformational. So the fact that its mission relates to the climate crisis underlines a key point, one which was also made just a couple of days ago when the Scottish Infrastructure Commission published its Phase 1 report. Every single investment we make on transport, on housing, utilities, health, education, whatever, has to be compatible with that move to a net zero economy. We must raise productivity and living standards while also lowering emissions. And of course, at the same time as we're moving to a net zero economy, we will also increasingly be using technology, automation, artificial intelligence. And again, this is an area where Scotland has huge potential. Edinburgh University School of Informatics, which is just about 100 yards away from where we are right now, is one of the most respected anywhere in the entire world. It's part of a wider ecosystem that has made Scotland one of the best places in Europe to establish a tech business. Our expertise in big data is an important part of that. So these two changes, automation and decarbonisation, are ones which present Scotland actually with more opportunities than threats. But they need to be managed with care if they don't compound economic and social injustice rather than help us to address these. There are enormous social, economic and, especially in the case of AI, ethical issues that we have to seriously confront and consider. I grew up, as many of you know, in Ayrshire back in the 1970s and 80s, and I'm acutely conscious from my own life experience of the impact that deindustrialisation had then, just as I suspect many of you will be aware of that from different communities across the country. The changes of the next decade, the ones that we're speaking about here today, of course won't exactly replicate previous transformations. The opportunities for Scotland from automation and decarbonisation, I think, are more significant and perhaps more obvious than they were with the economic transformations of the past. But we still need to be careful about the real possibility that individuals and communities get left behind, or that they feel they are being left behind. That's, for example, why the Scottish Government has worked and is working closely with the Scottish Trade Union Congress to consider the impact of automation on employment. Our commitment to skills and education places an increasing emphasis on retraining, which is evident in the new Economic Action Plan, which was published just this morning. We need to ensure that people can change careers or develop new skills as the economy changes. In fact, this issue is so important that the STUC has even formed a partnership with the CBI in Scotland, specifically to promote retraining. So it's bringing organisations that previously might not have been too keen to work together in a spirit of collaboration. And for the longer term, we are also starting to explore more radical approaches. We're working with local authorities, for example, to explore the feasibility of trialling a universal basic income. Now, that's something seen, amongst other things, as a possible response to job losses from automation. Now, I'll be frank here, it's an idea that might ultimately prove to be impractical, but that's the point of exploring trials. We want to be able to assess and test how it works in practice because we have to be open to new approaches and new ways of thinking. And perhaps most importantly of all, we've appointed a Just Transition Commission to advise how we ensure that the move to net zero doesn't leave people and communities behind, but that we seize the potential to ensure that its benefits are shared across the country. And I believe that will play a really important role in helping us to avoid the mistakes that were made in the economic upheavals of the past while seizing the opportunities that they offer for the future. In all of the work we're doing on a just transition, which I think is crucial to this very concept of economic justice going forward, we're really conscious of the importance of place, of making sure not just that people don't get left behind, but that communities and different regions of the country don't either. The National Investment Bank, as well as its net zero mission, will also have a mission to finance projects that can have a transformative impact on particular local areas. It's also why we've placed a heavy emphasis on ensuring that broadband, 4G, 5G infrastructure becomes available in all parts of Scotland, because these big technological advancements, if they're not done properly and fairly, will operate to deepen and embed inequality, not help us to transcend and overcome it. It's also that focus on place why it's so important that we continue to invest in quality, affordable housing in every part of the country. Over the course of this Parliament, of course, we're supporting the provision of 50,000 new affordable homes. In addition, city and regional deals enable local authorities to work differently and with others on key local priorities. And we set up what's called the Scottish Centre for Regional Inclusive Growth, which is helping local authorities and economic partnerships get the data that they need to ensure that the growth plans they are devising actually benefit those most in need. For too long, the UK, Scotland included, has had some of the most extreme regional inequalities anywhere in Europe. For us to be consistent with any notion of economic justice in the future, that must be tackled, and it must be tackled with a real sense of urgency. Alongside place, of course, we also have to focus on people, on enabling individuals to have fulfilling work opportunities at all stages of their lives and careers. And that's crucial to the issue of retraining that I mentioned a moment ago. Because of demographic change, a focus on people also requires us to encourage more immigration, something that hasn't been politically easy in recent times, certainly in a UK context, but something that I'm proud to say across the political spectrum, largely in Scotland, there is a real consensus behind. And the Scottish Government agrees wholeheartedly with the IPPR's view that immigration powers should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and we'll publish a detailed paper on that early next week. And a focus on people is at the heart of the final area that I want to talk about in the context of economic justice, which is fair work. The Scottish Government has made a concerted effort over the past 5 years to not just encourage fair work practices, but to really embed them in our whole notion of how a good economy should work. We have, as just one example, promoted the living wage, and we have a higher proportion of living wage employees than any of the other UK countries, although there's still work to be done. We established a few years ago the Scottish Business Pledge, which now covers more than 100,000 workers across the country. Paying the living wage is just one of its core principles. And our Fair Work First policy is now seeking to ensure that when governments are giving companies enterprise grants, or when we're using our purchasing power to procure things, then we're increasingly taking account of a company's employment practices. And the basic principle here that fair work is good for employees, for businesses and for society as a whole is being encouraged not just in rhetoric, but in our purchasing power and in all the financial decisions that we take. And a good example of the importance we attach to fair work is our emphasis on collective bargaining. I talked about the National Performance Framework earlier. One of our performance indicators is the proportion of employees who are covered by collective bargaining agreements. Because we recognise, and again, this is something that is not recognised even in every part of the UK, let alone elsewhere in the world, collective bargaining and trade union membership brings benefits not just to individual workers, although clearly it does, but to the economy as a whole, because it helps to create a stronger sense of security for employees. It gives them a greater voice in how businesses are run, and ultimately it's linked not simply to higher wages, but to increased productivity. And our commitment to fair work is one way of reinforcing that message, as are many of the other initiatives that we are taking forward. And I think it's important to note, since I'm aware this has been a concern of IPPR, that these initiatives aren't simply about growth sectors like tech or energy. They're just as relevant to more traditional sectors like retail and tourism, perhaps in many respects more so given some of the more traditional practices that we see there. When I'm discussing this, I've in the past pointed to the example of West Germany after the war, when it developed what became known as Rhine capitalism. It was based on a strong sense of partnership between business, trade unions and the public sector. By encouraging competitive markets, but making sure we combine them with strong social protections, we help to create an economy which is characterised by innovation, high productivity and a strong export base. What we're seeking to create here in Scotland isn't identical, of course, but there are quite clear parallels, and there are also very strong connections to recent work by the IPPR and other organisations. One of the central economic challenges that Scotland has faced in the past decade has been low productivity growth, and that has led to lower wage growth. Now, we're getting our act together on this. Our productivity has grown faster than the UK's as a whole. We've now largely closed the gap which used to exist between Scotland and the rest of the UK, but we are still a long way behind many of our European partners. And in trying to close that gap, Scotland cannot compete, certainly not successfully, and in my view we shouldn't try to compete through a race to the bottom on wages or regulation. We can only prosper by aiming for the top in terms of quality, innovation and skills in putting well-being and economic justice at the heart of everything we do. I know that the RSA and the Carnegie Institute published last week a document which set out how good work, as they termed it, could actually solve many of the UK's productivity problems. And of course, the IPPR has consistently stressed the benefits of social partnerships, which actually is an approach taken for granted in many European countries, including Germany, and one that underpins much of their success. So in many ways, the Scottish Government is trying to create precisely that kind of partnership for productivity, fairness and well-being, encouraging workers, employers and the public sector to work together to create better jobs, to ultimately improve business competitiveness and to raise justice and overall living standards. But one of the reasons, and this will take me to my final point, one of the many reasons that I am concerned about the approach the UK government is taking to Brexit. I'm an opponent of Brexit, but I want to concentrate particularly on the approach that's been taken, is the prospect, I think the very real prospect, that it could undermine so much of what we're trying to achieve that I have been talking about here today. I know the UK government has said that backing better standards is part of the approach it's taking. And it's worth saying that there may well be aspects of their wider economic plans, for example, if they do follow through on promises to invest more in infrastructure, that I would welcome. But if we judge on actions rather than words, I find it hard to be overly encouraged at the moment. When we look at the changes that were made to the EU withdrawal agreement during the negotiations last October, for trading goods, the old Theresa May political declaration said that the UK's relationship with the EU should be as close as possible. That reference has gone. In addition, references to compatible regulatory approaches, full alignment with EU rules and pledges on environmental and workers' rights have all been weakened or removed. So though we've heard promises that Brexit won't lead to lower standards, I think the actions so far appear to point to a different direction of travel, which is a move away from EU standards. And that message indeed was underlined by the Chancellor over the weekend. I think that approach leaves wide open the prospect of doing one thing that would harm Scotland, weakening our social and environmental protections, in order to do another thing which will harm Scotland, weakening our trade ties with Europe. The Scottish Government will do everything we can to oppose that direction of travel. Because one of the things that not just the Scottish Government, but I think many people in Scotland value about the European Union, because it's not perfect, but one of the things we value about it is the idea of a social Europe. In an age of really big trading blocs, the EU consistently grapples with a fundamental question. How can countries benefit from internationalisation, free trade, advances in technology, while also maintaining high standards and protecting the welfare of individual citizens? In my view, deregulation cannot be part of the answer to that question. That's why the Scottish Government, in line with everything I've been talking about today, is determined that we will uphold environmental standards and consumer protections. We will continue to argue for employment law to be devolved to Scotland so that we can protect workers' rights. We believe, given all of the comments that Russell made about future trade negotiations and the big impact on everything we're talking about here today that they will have, that the Scottish Parliament and all of the devolved administrations must have a role in ratifying these. And of course, I'll continue to argue that the people of Scotland should have the right to decide on a different future through an independence referendum. Above all else, however, in everything we do, the Scottish Government will try to exemplify in our approach to policy making the idea that fairness and prosperity go hand in hand. It must do so. We'll try to meet the challenges of the coming decade in a way that improves productivity, lowers our greenhouse gas emissions and enhances well-being, that increases, not widens, increases economic justice, not widens injustice and inequality. And I believe very strongly that that is the best way forward for all of us. I mentioned at the start, or I should have mentioned at the start, how nice it is always to be here in this building in the National Museum. One of the most impressive exhibits that this building has is the James Watt and Matthew Boulton steam engine. dating back to 1786. And that's a reminder of the fact that in so many respects, Scotland led the world into the industrial age. Now that should inspire us, but not about past achievements, but about what we can achieve in the future. In just 10 months, Glasgow will host COP26, the most important climate change summit since Paris in 2015, 5 years ago. In fact, in many ways, I think it's more important than Paris, given the urgency of what we face. And I think the aim for all of us is to be clear then that modern Scotland is leading the world into the decarbonised age. I want us to play our part through technological innovation by developing low and zero carbon products and technologies. But I also want us to show that leadership through policy innovation to demonstrate that a greener future can also be a wealthier, healthier, happier and fairer future. And if we focus on well-being, economic justice, a just transition and fair work, then it won't be easy. There are big challenges along the way, but I believe we can achieve that. And then we can secure a positive and a lasting legacy that we might be able to look back on at the start of the next decade. So thank you very much for listening today. And finally, my thanks to the IPPR. As we face up to these challenges, it's always encouraging to know that we have the support of the expertise and experience of organisations like this one. So thank you all very much indeed.